So this panel is going to explore the area of the working relationships between industry on the one hand and sort of all the other stakeholder interests that are interested in what industry is doing, and interested in protection of the environment, health and safety, all of that. The issues that we're going to talk about in this panel have been alluded to by all of the previous panels, so there's sort of a little bit of overlap, except that really we're going to focus on those things really directly. The format is that I gave the panelists some moderator questions before, and for each question, some of the panel members have prepared answers, and then we also have an opportunity for them to have kind of on-the-spot conversations with each other if they wish. And hopefully we'll have some time for questions, or if you have a burning question, you can raise your hand. We'll try to make time to deal with that as we go along. So quick introductions. Sandra Allen is Assistant Attorney General in Utah Attorney General's Office. She's Chief of the Environmental Section of the Environment Health Division. Is that right? And because this is important to us at the College of Law, she is a College of Law alum. Rob Dubuque is a staff attorney for the Salt Lake City Office of Western Resource Advocates. He is also a College of Law alum. That may be the end of that. Okay, Joseph Havasi, did I do that right?
Yes.
Is Director of Natural Resources at Compass Minerals International. Next, actually, okay, Lisa Kirshner is partner in the Salt Lake City Office of Parsons, Bailey, and Latimer. And then at the end is Dan Johnson, who's retired from Chevron after a 30-plus year career in corporate advertising, government affairs. He was on the leadership team and a lot more things that it's good. There's a long, long list of things that he did in his good career with Chevron. Okay, so our first question, and actually with this question, I think everybody on the panel hopefully has something to share. And it's a really umbrella question of how important is it for industry to have a positive and constructive relationship with the local community, its leaders, the public, environmental groups, and regulators. And if it's important, how does such a relationship develop? And maybe we can start with Dan.
Thank you. Need to say a couple things right off the bat, if I might. I worked for Chevron for 31 years. I'm not here on behalf of Chevron today. I've got to make that disclaimer. I let them know that I was coming so they wouldn't be surprised. And that's kind of one of my first principles of maintaining relationships with people, whether it's in government, whether it's in politics, whether it's in the bureaucracy, whether it's in other businesses, is the comment of no surprises. I didn't want to surprise Chevron by being here. So the opinions that I express are really mine. But of course, since I was with the company for so many years, I draw on some of those experiences and relate to that. So if you will pardon me a little bit, I will try to keep that principle not to speak, but at the same time, some of the experiences that I draw upon when I comment will be that. I wanted to say that relationships are incredibly important for industry. And one of those relationships that I developed when I was with Chevron here was with the Wallace Stegner Center. You know, I'd been born in the West, but I don't know that I really knew that I was a Westerner until I started reading Wallace Stegner, until I started attending many of the symposiums that they had. And I gained some real insights, and I gained some skills that made me more effective as an industry representative. And that was, I really got much more attuned to Western environmental issues, so that I was in a position within my own company to advise on things that perhaps they didn't have that perspective, because they're not a company that's based in Utah. They're based in California with worldwide operations. And I was going to comment, one of the things that I'm a little disappointed about in not being able to identify my Chevron representation is that one time I got a high honor. I was deemed to be the chairman of Chevron for North Salt Lake. And I think that's probably one of the highest honors I got. But in any case, I say that is that I want to thank Jan and Nystrom and Bob Kiter for including me in the program today. But I think that it's so critical for industry, especially if they want to develop relationships with the environmental community and get an environmental perspective and to improve their operations and their footprint in the community, they really need to put themselves out there and sometimes get in uncomfortable situations, uncomfortable discussions with people. It's very important. So I live in Massachusetts now. I'm not really involved with the oil and gas industry. So I come here often shaking my head back and forth between Utah and Massachusetts. Of course, one state is predominantly Republican, Utah, if you hadn't guessed. The other one is overwhelmingly Democrat. The number of Republicans that are in the State House in Massachusetts could all fit in a telephone booth. And from what I understand, probably the same number of Democrats in Utah could fit in a similarly sized telephone booth. We have no representation in our congressional delegation from any Republican. There is a Republican governor. And in Utah, of course, kind of just the reverse. I don't think there's any. So my head swims a little bit. I want to say that in preparing for this discussion about relationships is that there is some news occasionally in Massachusetts that comes out about political corruption. The last three speakers of the Massachusetts House of Representatives, I guess you might call it, I don't think they, resigned from office for a variety of infractions. And when we talk about developing political relationships, for example, and having them, that was kind of in my mind when I thought about participating in this panel. Because it kind of drew me back to a time in my career in the 1980s when I went to Sacramento and was assigned as the company's head lobbyist there. And I had as my intent to go visit the new governor of the state, all his key aides, to meet with every legislator in the state, to meet with the head regulatory agency person. And I embarked on that task. And my strategy is, and the importance that I feel about those relationships, that unless you really sit down and talk with somebody for at least an hour, and sometimes it needs more, you need to have a discussion with people to develop a relationship. You can't do it on the internet. You can't do it through letters. You have to sit down and talk to them. So I purposely went through that discussion with many, many legislators and many people in the administration, and I learned a lot. I learned about how much some Democrats really hated oil companies. I found out how some Republicans didn't really like them for other reasons. But going through those discussions, I found that I found some common ground with some people, so that as I was representing my company on some issues, that I was surprised that occasionally I would get a key indicator of support, a vote, from a Democratic legislator around the time, because I'd taken the time to really talk with him or her about a particular issue, or brought an expert in to talk to that person. And so it was really gratifying. There were some wary moments that I had, though, about relationships, is that most often the discussions were very substantive and very good, and I thought that, we did find some common ground and a basis to work on in many, many cases, on some environmental legislation, cogeneration, when we had to replace a rock groin at our El Segundo refinery that went off into Santa Monica Bay. I found that people were supportive and understanding. But at the same time, you get into relationships sometimes, and this is the point about compliance, is that sometimes when, at least I, as an oil company representative, wanted to engage people, there were a few people who only wanted to talk about money. Now, oil companies do make campaign contributions. They follow the law. And one of the things that I think is so important, especially in political relationships, and we've talked about compliance today, and there's an incident happening, is that companies, large and small, need to follow the law with regards to political compliance. It's fundamental to having a relationship of trust with in the community and being able to advocate your case. And so people need to be trained, they need to know how to respond to situations, and they need how to do the right thing. Is that okay?
Good.
So that's kind of an entree for me in my discussion. Now, there are a whole host of groups that we were asked to address, and they included one that I thought was particularly important, or not one that was particularly important, was the media. We have many stakeholders in the oil and gas industry, including local neighbors and communities, the media, elected officials, regulatory officials, and a host of other people. I just want to say a little bit about regulatory officials.
Can I stop?
Yeah. Time? Okay.
Yeah, and
I'll
you get
stop.
another chance.
I'll get another
Okay,
chance.
thank you. Okay, thanks,
Yeah.
Sandra.
Was really kind of happy to have the opportunity to speak today. I know that might be a surprise, you know, who wants to do this late on a Friday afternoon. But one of the things that I was kind of excited about is to address how industries and the Utah Department of Environmental Quality and the Attorney General's office can have better relationships. And I took a poll of my office. I wanted to have some input from some of our attorneys. There are 10 of us co-housed here at the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. And I asked them, what should I tell these people? What should I tell them is a good reason to think that it would be important for them to have a good relationship with the Utah Department of Environmental Quality? And I got 2 answers, and it was really interesting to me today that I've heard these repeatedly throughout almost every single panel. First of all is the issue of scrutiny. If the agency perceives you as, you know, a bad actor, really, repeatedly trying to evade compliance, then there's going to be a lot more scrutiny. And I don't think that this isn't just an issue of an occasional accident, because I think there can be some understanding of addressing that accident, trying to do something about it. I don't think a single instance makes someone a bad actor. But, you know, sometimes you come across people who just don't want to do what they're supposed to do. And when inspectors feel they've come across that type of person, then they watch them a lot. In fact, one of our people compared it to living in a neighborhood. You know, you have your good neighbors and you have your bad neighbors, and you know you're going to keep an eye on. And that's how they feel about people who they put into that category. The second thing that I've also heard repeated throughout the day is the concept of public perception and the industry's reputation with the public. And you know, sometimes industry thinks that they're not really being very fairly perceived, maybe not, but the fact is that when we have a neighborhood that is really concerned about something one of their neighbors is doing in terms of if they feel like there's a lot of pollution that's impacting them or they're worried about it, then they contact us and we listen very carefully to their concerns. And they don't stop just by contacting the Attorney General's office or the Utah Department of Environmental Quality. They go throughout their entire calling list, from the governor to every legislator or mayor or county commissioner. They talk to everybody that they know. And so I think that if you're able to have a good relationship, then you are able to avoid being the one that is constantly watched and having your neighbors drive you out of town with pitchforks. So those are 2 important reasons. And then one of the things that I wanted to address is how do you achieve that kind of a good relationship with your neighborhood? Well, first of all, you act in good faith to comply with the law and to protect public health and to protect the environment. Second, you keep communicating. You help the agency and its attorneys understand you and what your issues are, what your problems are, and how if you disagree with something with a particular way that we're interpreting a provision of the law, then fine, come and talk to us, but don't just not comply. Third, don't make it personal. Don't blame the individuals in the agency for being out to get you if you get a notice of violation. Instead, try to figure out what the problem is and fix it. And fourth, and I think that this is one way that attorneys can really, really help their clients, and that is to establish credibility by understanding the facts, carefully understanding the facts of what have happened and what the law is that is applicable in the situation, and then just in an educated way, discussing those with the agency and their attorneys.
Hello. I had the good fortune to work for a mining company out in the eastern United States, a French company, Lafarge, and I experienced a year at Lafarge. They do basic materials, industrial materials, aggregates and cement and concrete. Experienced a year where they actually went through a mining year with 0 injuries. That's incredible to have 0 recordable injuries. That's the monumental place where a mining company wants to be. And the company had a concept, and I'm sure it's familiar to a lot of you, but visible felt leadership. And that is for the leadership to get out into the company, into the employee base, and just engage, just understand what the daily issues are, what's going on in their life, not as a checklist, but to honestly go out and engage with folks. And I'm a geologist, and I dealt in land matters for Lafarge. So I was a land manager, and it was a little awkward for the land guy to go out and talk to the guy who's making piles and crushing rock and whatnot. But I took that concept when I came to Compass Minerals, and now as the Director of Natural Resources, I look over land, mineral rights, license to operate, which is kind of a broad category, but whatever we need to continue to operate, I'm responsible for. And having the honor of operating on the Great Salt Lake, which is just an incredible natural feature, and there's so much going on. There's so much study and engagement and various groups. I applied the visible felt leadership principle to, I need to get out there and I need to understand what's going on from all levels, all different perspectives. And it's been very helpful, to understand the science and the different perspectives of folks on the lake, to help understand how they view us, and then maybe kind of expand the company's view on what else is going on the lake. So it's that visible felt leadership that kind of bleeds into my management of my little function or piece of the company, which is really the implicit license to operate. You can't be a bad actor and steamroll people's concerns and just get what you want every time and ignore concerns that may be valid. You really can't do it. It's not sustainable. You may be successful. You may be able to string up a number of successes, operating in that manner, but it's not sustainable. You're going to need something at some point to continue to operate. So it's really just getting out there and engaging and understanding, and then interpreting, how that juxtaposes to your operation and what you want to achieve, where you want to go, and translating that to the leadership in the company. Well, I understand directionally this is the way we want to go. Here's some very real things that we need to consider as we move forward, and it's just that direct engagement.
I represent a pretty diverse group of environmental and conservation interests, and I think there are very few instances where there is not some room to engage in a discussion about concerns. There are some. I would say oil shale tar sands, there's not a whole lot of wiggle room. But look at something like Great Salt Lake. If you look at the groups that are involved, the diverse interest groups that are involved, I mean, you really have to step back if you're an industry that's somehow involved in that discussion. And, you know, you can't just put your finger on a single stereotype and say this is who we're dealing with, because I would say largely they're a lot of gray hair, a well-educated group, very sophisticated politically, and they really care about a resource. And across the political spectrum, Republicans, Democrats, duck hunters, bird watchers, you know, coming together for a purpose, because they really care. And I think that in terms of, and I'm certainly not going to, not in a position to say what industry should or should not do, but from the perspective of the clients I represent, I think sometimes they feel shut out of the process. And that's very frustrating, because they feel that they have something to add. They feel genuinely concerned about the resource, and they want to, they want to be part of it. And yet, oftentimes, what happens is that industry and agencies get together because that's part of what they do in terms of coming up with permits and stuff, or making decisions, and the public doesn't have a seat at the table. And so the folks that we're talking about, these sophisticated, well-heeled individuals in some cases, they don't take kindly to that. They don't like to be shut out. They feel they have something to add. And so, if industry doesn't sit down and talk with them, or the agencies don't give them an opportunity to be part of the process, and they kind of force their way in terms of lawsuits. It's sort of, because what other option do they have? I will credit Joe when he came in terms of Compass Minerals. They have a very ambitious expansion plan for Great Salt Lake. And when that was initially put out to the public, it met extreme resistance. I mean, there was universal resistance to this proposal. But over the course of time, I think through a lot of persistence and patience, Joe and some others from the company were willing to sit down and engage with the various groups and say, what is it you really want? And I think that requires suspending judgment. I think that requires that, people just connect on a people level. That, you don't go into this with basically, well, it's just a bunch of environmentalists that are just standing in the way of progress. It's not that simple. And if you're willing to sit down and talk, and obviously it's just personality dependent, I think folks will find that in the case of this expansion, are people thrilled that there's going to be such a large expansion on Great Salt Lake? No. But I think largely that resistance has faded away as the company has responded to specific concerns, made changes to their proposal. And I think that's the type of thing that is possible well in advance of a decision being made, well in advance of a permit being issued. Because once permits are issued, I think people become invested in them, both at the agency level and with the company. And it's hard to back down from that. So I think the time to engage is early in the process rather than later.
Thank you. I have a little bit of a different perspective on this issue, and it's more, and I have learned a lot just listening to folks today, but I view, we've talked a lot about credibility and transparency, we collectively, the different panels, and from a practical perspective, I think those concepts are invaluable. And I go back to what David Nutt said earlier today from Huntsman. And he said that when the Chemical Safety Board arrived on site, they stayed for a relatively short period of time and left. And they left because they knew the report that was being prepared related to that horrendous incident in Texas was being prepared professionally by in-house expertise that were going to do a credible job and they could rely on it. Relationships take a long time to build, and to develop those relationships where the agency will come in and say, this is going to be professional, credible, we can rely on it. And they're fleeting. The flip side, you can burn bridges pretty darn quickly as an industry or as a representative of industry. And so I bear that in mind in this whole context of this issue, that it is absolutely critical to recognize, first of all, as a representative of industry, you've got, as I think Rob was suggesting, you've got a wealth of knowledge. Face it, you know, the folks that are representing the NGOs or that are at the agencies, they've got multitudes of issues and companies, industries, interests that they're trying to learn, come up the learning curve to better represent their interests. You, if you're an industry or representing an industry, you know, these people know what's going on at their site better than anyone, hands down. Utilizing that expertise in a way that's credible can pay dividends. The CSB goes home. They look at the report and they can rely on it because it's credible. You've got scientists, say, in your industry sector that know a particular issue. I'm a water quality lawyer, so that's the perspective and context I come to this with. An individual that knows more about the particular fate and transport of a constituent than anyone virtually in the country. That person can bring a level of knowledge to documentation that can actually assist the under-resourced EPA. We had EPA say, you know, we have a very, very slim, lean staff. We need help. So to the extent you can build a relationship and then be able to share the knowledge that is, you know, you beyond your industry, beyond any other interest group has the most knowledge of, it just makes practical sense. Another example I can bring based on my years of practice is oftentimes companies can do a very good job of documenting in detail in collaboration with, for example, the Division of Water Quality and their lawyers, what the foundation was for developing, for example, a permit term or condition. The more you document that, the better off it is, because then when you've got Rob's group or someone else trying to understand why did they put this particular condition in the permit, if it's explained, it becomes more, it's hopefully bring people up the learning curve faster, which is in everyone's best interests. And also it leaves less room for debate. You've got kind of a story that's been told. And from a practical perspective, there's institutional knowledge that people in 10 or 15 years can go back and look, what was the original reason for including, for example, in a permit, this particular provision. That can pay dividends because it helps underscore that there wasn't anything surreptitious or underhanded about this. It's spelled out clearly, and people may agree to disagree, but at least the incentive behind what has been developed is there. So that's my perspective on kind of one side of relationships, is that there are practical dividends that can be, that come out of ensuring that these relationships are developed and maintained for years, and that you've got documentation to support that.
Okay, next question is, what is the role of trust? It's a word that's come up a good bit. And can a reasonable level of trust be achieved between various interests when there are always potential conflicts in how matters are viewed by those different interests? And Rob, maybe you want to go first.
Yeah, so this is the touchy-feely panel, in case you didn't pick up on that. Sorry, Michelle. You know, trust is we're talking about relationships here. We're talking about people with differing viewpoints who disagree with each other. And how do you do that in a civil manner? And, you know, you don't have to be friends with folks on the other side, but you do have to be friendly. And you have to be able to see things from their perspective. just like you want them to see things from your perspective. I mean, we're talking about just basic human courtesy here. I don't know how else to put it. I think when you get into these type of discussions, if you're going to sit and meet with folks who disagree with you, I think you check your ego and your emotions at the door, because they just get in the way. Environmental groups tend to be very passionate about their cause. And that's just the nature of what they believe, and they believe in it strongly. As an attorney representing them, I don't have that luxury. I cannot be an alter ego of the groups I represent. First of all, I mean, I don't know where I'd start. I would say I've got such a broad spectrum, but it's just, I make a point of being friendly, of being, hey, how you doing? What's going on? How's the family? I think that you have to have that basic level, and trust is something that you have to earn, and you can lose it just in a heartbeat. I mean, you can't mess around. You can't stab the other guy in the back. You can't go to the press and diss the guy in a public statement so you get a soundbite. You can't do that, because that whatever trust you've built is going away. So it is fragile, and I think you just need to recognize that, and I think you just need to continue to respect the other person and respect their point of view, and hopefully you establish a level of trust at some point.
Obviously, I concur with everything Rob said, but I would add this, as an attorney, ultimately, if we don't have our integrity and we don't abide and have an ethical practice, what do you have? You don't have a whole lot. So fundamentally, as a professional, that it's essential that you do what you need to do to practice ethically, and hopefully what follows is trust. Moreover, to the extent that you want to, for example, enter in settlement negotiations with another party, bring them up the learning curve on particular issues for which you have opposite views, you've got to have a level of trust that you're going to be able to accomplish something that is fundamentally of interest to both sides in order to move forward and invest the time and energy it takes to do that. So I would argue that you've got to build this level of trust in order, in many instances, to be able to resolve your issues and problems outside of the litigation process. If you're really hoping to sit down and be able to effectively resolve an issue outside of an adjudicative or litigation, you got to have some level of trust. So it's a practical consideration to actually, forwarding clients' interests or calculating whether that's the way you want to go. I just have been noticing, I've been reading the trade regs, and I've just been noticing, the flurry of FACA lawsuits and allegations regarding undue collaboration between, for example, environmental groups or NGOs and state agencies and the like. And, it's unfortunate that those sorts of circumstances arise, but to be quite honest, it's been something that you see more and more of in the press. And so there's a suggestion that, these sorts of relationships need, as has been suggested, need to be absolutely fundamentally above board, professional, and you've got to protect that, because there are consequences to not ensuring that that's the order of the day.
Any other panel members have a...
Yeah, I just want to say from a perspective of larger companies, as a follow-up, is that I think this whole thing about developing relationships has to start at the top of an organization. Because if it doesn't, you have people that might not be willing to engage in developing those kinds of relationships unless they are comfortable that their management sees a value in it and is driving the fact that you need to engage with people. The concern that I have and have seen in the past is that people get engaged, let's say, and may not have that direction from their company. And all of a sudden, they're creating a situation of untrust with the other side because they can't follow through on what they've talked about. And so I think having that, an alignment in a company from the top to the bottom that encourages communication, and then making sure that the company develops the resources to have those discussions, because engagement takes time and money, and in order to do it well, you have to have people committed to sit down, talk, listen, share information, be transparent, to do the things that are right that build a civil and good relationship.
You else want to add anything on trust? What are the important factors in ensuring that honesty and civility be present in these relationships? And maybe if Joe, you could start us off.
I could probably summarize that in one word, courage. Rob mentioned earlier the stakeholder group, as a large group, their desire to become involved earlier. And it takes courage to do that, and trust, and a lot of other factors. And I agree with that, because, you know, as an advocate for a company, for a project, for something that the company desires to do, you have to be honest and realistic with yourself. You have to design this thing, and if you just design it to meet your functional need, and you're very myopic in doing it, and ignoring potential issues or different perspectives that could affect the likelihood of a positive outcome or the sustainability of the project or other surprises, it's better to engage in those discussions and be honest with yourself and the company that those are going to need to be had. And if you spend a lot of time going through design and or far down the line, and you make promises, you know, to your shareholders or to your company or to the market, without really being honest with yourself, that is this thing truly executable, then you're setting yourself up for failure. So the courage early on to engage groups that will have differing views, and you know, some passion on protecting elements of what may be changed or impacted or what have you, it is important to come up with a project that, for the most part, hopefully meets all of your needs, or you know, the lion's share of them. But from my perspective, having courage also applies to interfacing with my leadership, and being able to talk to the CEO and the CFO, saying, well, yes, this is our desire, but there's not a strong probability we're going to succeed. So, you know, we should just start planning accordingly, and you know, redesigning and looking at other ways to do it more efficiently with less of a footprint, what have you. So it's just that honesty and courage, I think, is very important. So you can have a civil discussion, and you're not always playing defense when you're interfacing with a stakeholder group who disagrees with you, and you're kind of trapped. You don't want to be trapped as an advocate for a project or a company.
From my perspective, having that honest and civil relationship, I think it's very important to do what you say and say what you do. Don't surprise people. I think that often, sometimes, surprises happen in a relationship, and if you don't give somebody a heads up that some decision is being made that might impact them, for example, that you're going to expand a facility or have plans, and the community finds out this at the last moment, I don't think you want to be in a position of surprising people. I think it's really incredibly important to watch your rhetoric and stereotypes, because to the extent that we stereotype people, I know there's a tendency at times within industry to stereotype the environmental community, and I think one needs to recognize there's a whole broad group of different interests and people that you can engage with, and that to be civil and have those relationships, you don't want to stereotype people. And the other thing is to recognize that, I think your behavior is tempered if you think that you have no permanent enemies nor permanent friends. That tomorrow another issue might arise or a situation where you're going to need someone. If you act like the issue that you're engaged in right now is the last one that you're ever going to deal with a particular group, then you call out the stops and it's war, but the situation is that always doesn't set you up to deal with the next particular issue. So I think it's really critically important that we think that we recognize that issues change, people change, the size they take, and that we need to be able to adjust ourselves to be able to work with somebody the next day, and as a result, the relationship will remain more civil and honest on that basis.
Any of the other panel members on honesty, civility, maybe some examples? An uncivil example, no. Yeah.
I have something to add to Dan's point of stereotypes. I could tell you behind closed doors in a company, the stereotypes and the pejoratives that are flying around, for groups or folks that don't see the world as you do. At one point, I stopped the discussion. We can't. You can't use those pejoratives, and we need to stop doing that inside, and just be disciplined, because we want a lot of what they want. We want a clean lake. We don't, we rely on that lake. It's a resource for us. It's important to protect it. It's important to make sure there's water in it. Why are we using, environmentalist as a negative? Because in reality, at the core, we are too, in a different way, but in a different perspective. But just it helps promote the civil discourse and following that discipline.
Actually, I'm going to put Rob on the spot. I'm allowed because he's a former student now. Okay, he's used to it. But are there stereotypes going in the other direction as well, perhaps from
Sure.
some of the people you work with?
Sure,
vis-a-vis?
and those are counterproductive. We can't make devils out of people. We can't, put motives into, or what we perceive to be motives, or to say, well, they're just out for money. It's complicated. I know that some of the folks that I went to law school with went to work for industry, and that sometimes folks, well, they're just selling out and stuff. It's like, whoa, time out. People have to live. They have to pay bills. It's like, you can't see things that way. If you do see things that way, then I think you're always going to be polarized. And I just don't view the world that way. I don't think that's, look at this political process we have. It's like, oh my goodness. Answers lie in the middle. That's where the answers are. That's where the solutions are. That's just my take on it. And so if you're pointing fingers and you're calling folks names, even if you don't say it out loud, and even if they don't hear you, people know what you're feeling. People can sense what it is that you feel. It's like you're throwing off these vibes. You have to basically take your judgments and you need to just set them aside. You shouldn't look at Compass Minerals and say, geez, they're just out to make a buck. It's like, it's more complicated than that. So, as I said before, there are a lot of motions in environmental organizations. Maybe that's the nature of the beast. But I have a lot of conversations with folks that basically, when I'm saying, look, this is really not helpful. And I think that's, I don't know. I've said enough, I suppose.
I'll just make a comment. On the issue of what do you need to do to ensure that you have honesty and civility in relationships, I noticed behaviors in attorneys that are really effective in working with the agency, and I think that Carol Dinkins alluded to this earlier when she gave her introductory speech, and that is that when there are problems with your case, whether it's with the facts or the law, instead of pretending they don't exist, just acknowledge them. And I think that helps establish a lot of credibility with the agency. I've been in situations before early on when the tank program was kind of first starting where people didn't really think they had to do it because they had never had to do it before. I don't know why they didn't think they had to do it, but I would have people come in and they'd say that, this is going to cost me a lot of money, and yeah, I don't think you can make me do it. And one particular attorney I remember, and I have had so much respect from him since then, is he said, well, yeah, you do have to do it, and they can make you do it. And that helped establish a certain level of honesty and civility in the relationship, because he helped his client get over an unrealistic and unfounded expectation of what life was going to be like. And so we were able to reach kind of a compliance schedule where the attorney was able to, or the client was able to do the things that they needed to do because his attorney told him. And he believed his attorney because it's his attorney, where he's not going to believe me. So.
Okay. Great example. Did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I'm good on that one.
Okay. So I'm going to shamelessly put in a plug right now because I can already tell I just wrote the blog post. Okay, we have an environmental dispute resolution blog. There's paperwork on the back, and on Monday there's actually going to be a blog post that's very similar to what these folks were talking about. So please read it on Monday. Okay, now we're going to go, since this is for legal CLE credits, we're going to go a little bit into the role of counsel. So what is the role of counsel, the counsel for all the parties concerned, in ensuring ethical behavior and civility in the dealings between the various interested parties? And Lisa, maybe you can start us off.
First of all, let me preface my comments with my perspective, and this isn't Pollyannish, I mean, it's honest, heartfelt. I can't recall in my 25 years plus of practice running into many people that weren't civil and didn't approach most topics ethically. Now that's different than emotionally, but so I feel fortunate, and maybe I've just maybe here in Utah we're just unduly pleasant, but I really haven't had much direct, to be perfectly honest, much direct confrontation with folks that are, not civil or behave unethically. That being said, sometimes, clients will ask you to be, to advocate a position where, consistent with what Sandra just said, where it's really not legally a very strong position, and it could undermine, as I indicated before, the years of relationship building that's occurred. It's your obligation as counsel, I believe, to point those particular moments out and be dogmatic about your views. I mean, that's part of practicing law. But also, I think that as counsel, we can help set the tone. When you've got a very aggressive and granted, someone in one of our clients, I mean, they feel very strongly about their need to preserve, to protect their license to operate. They've got vested interest in permits and expenditures that have gone into years of obtaining these particular authorizations. So there are going to be, strong feelings about circumstances where obstacles are potentially put in the way to their being able to continue to operate in the way they have been. That being said, if counsel sets the tone as to what's the right approach going forward, that can go a long way towards making a much more pleasant work environment, and also, as I indicated before, perhaps effectuating better outcomes in terms of being able to actually communicate with folks that, perhaps have alternative views almost always. So I guess, we also have to remember now, we've got a rule of standard of professionalism and civility, 14-301, that mandates that we be civil to one another. again, I haven't run into, I want to hear the stories about, what prompted this rule, because I think it would just, maybe be, hopefully, slightly entertaining. But honestly, it's just a good reminder that typically you accomplish more things when people there's a discourse, and a discourse that's founded on, on civility, on actually, treating people in an appropriate manner. So, but to comply with the rule, we better all make sure we're doing that. So.
Oh, this one gave me some pause. I kind of had to think about it a little bit. And so again, I went and polled my, the 10 attorneys in our group and got kind of some background about what they thought was important. And one of the things that we often encounter in representing government is that because citizens have access to their government, and that's important, and yet at the same time, when attorneys are involved and you're involved in matters where you're in litigation or in some kind of enforcement action, if one attorney approaches the client, then usually, they tell the other attorney so that both attorneys are there and you don't have these kind of communications going forward where the attorney for one party is there, but not the attorney for the other party. And so there's certainly kind of a little bit of conflict in how that works out. And I can see a lot of faces here thinking, what is she talking about? So what I'm getting at, though, is if you have a meeting scheduled with the agency, then and you want to bring your attorney, then tell your attorney ahead of time so they know. Tell the agency people that you're meeting with so that they know, so that they can invite their attorneys if they want to, and they can all be there to get the same information and the same background, so they can figure out which attorneys are involved, so they might even have a telephone call outside of the meeting to try and figure out with each other what some of the legal issues are and bring each other up to speed a little bit on how they see the issues so you can have a more fruitful meeting. And so I'm just bringing that up because I think it happens commonly that people just get kind of swept up in the moment and they don't think about notifying the agency that they want counsel to come. In fact, they don't think about notifying their own counsel that they're going to invite them. They just want to, kind of tow them along because they're really excited about what they want to do or they're really worried about what they want to do. But the other thing I wanted to add in that, along the lines of attending a meeting, is that just because an attorney attends a meeting, because I attend a meeting, or because one of the people in my group attends a meeting, it doesn't mean we have the eagle eye on some kind of particular person that's at the meeting. We have some sort of regulatory or enforcement concern. Instead, it means that we need to be educated, we want to get the background, and we can do a lot better job and be a lot more fruitful if we're kind of in on the whole line of communications as they unfold, instead of being brought in at the very last minute to review something, say 5 minutes before you want to close your real estate deal and you want some kind of environmental assurance. So
if anything, it's sounding similar to to Rob's suggestion that the community should be involved early. Don't surprise us with what you want to do. Help us learn about it as you're thinking about it. Don't surprise the attorneys with what you want to do. Help us learn and think about it.
Right.
Okay, good. Dan.
There's another very practical part of that I've seen over the years on this question of counsel. Obviously, I referenced earlier the importance to make sure that there are processes and policies in place to make sure that there's political compliance is followed by companies and that you don't give someone the wrong kind of issue. It's very important. That is about your truthfulness and honesty in your political dealings. The other thing is that when times get tough, there sometimes is a debate within companies about how public you should be with your comments or not. And sometimes attorneys advise no comment. And as a result, it sticks, and that when the spokesman that is engaged with the media, and I've always looked at the media as giving you a fair deal, I've never been misquoted in 30 years, But the point is, if you don't talk to the media, you can't reach the public if you're kind of guarded in by a no comment policy. And when that happens, no comment, that means that it kind of ends the discussion. And people that are concerned about a particular issue and have something that they're really interested in, that just shuts down the conversation, invites an incivil relationship. So the role of counsel, I think we have to find out, and I've had this debate I've seen this debate within industry circles, within different companies, is resist that tendency to say no comment and work out a way in which parties can engage. I understand there are issues about litigation and other kinds of things, but the point is, if you shut down the conversation by saying there's no comment on this, you'll get hostile relationships, and you'll find that people are not civil to each other.
Any other reactions or comments? Do you want to say?
Well, I oftentimes get questions from my clients, can't you do anything? There's not always a legal avenue. I think that to the degree that citizens engage in the process, come to board meetings, petition their government, not every solution is found in the courtroom. In fact, few are. We settle 97% of all civil matters. So, it's oftentimes the answer is go meet with them rather than, bring a challenge. It's just, we all know the Rule 11, for the attorneys in the room, Rule 11, you can't bring frivolous legal action. You have to have a basis for it. And that's, sometimes your clients don't want to hear that. It's messy out there. But, I think by citizens participating in the process, I think that really makes for a better permitting process. It makes the agencies accountable. And I just think it makes for a better result. So.
There's one other thing I wanted to say, man, just quickly. Sure. And that is, I think, an appreciation by legal counsel of the role of public affairs within the company. Historically, there has a lot of companies that I've seen historically were kind of controlled by the legal process. And it gets back to this no comment thing, is that I think there's a recognition that other people need to be brought into the discussion about what the solutions are to deal with some of these knotty issues. And they're not just all legal solutions. You have to involve a broader perspective, and that includes people that are familiar with the local area in which you're operating in. You bring in people that know and understand the media. You know people that might have a little bit different perspective than you would. It might not be legal, but there's a value in bringing that in. And I think for attorneys to kind of broaden out their perspective and to bring in a wider audience in the decision-making on some of these decisions can be very effective, and again, promote more civil relationships between companies and community groups and individuals.
I'd actually be interested if any of the attorneys would have any response to that. Or like, when do you decide that attorneys should be involved or should not be involved absent litigation, sort of?
Well, just a short comment on that. I mean, typically, and it's consistent with what Sandra was suggesting, typically in environmental regulatory matters, just as with Sandra saying it's important to be in on sometimes the ground floor, so you're not being asked at the last minute to understand what was the foundation for negotiating this particular permit condition. That's true for outside counsel representing industry as well. And so oftentimes being engaged early on, maybe you're a member more of the permit team than they're in an advocacy role or in an adversarial position. That's been my experience over the years, and it will save a lot of time and effort down the road. And again, it sure is better to be sitting around a table talking early on in understanding what the foundation was for things than, being at fisticuffs, at the 11th hour because there's people aren't up to speed on what the foundation was.
We take some questions. Do we have any questions from the audience?
If the panel, members of the panel would be willing to reflect on, given our topic of the interaction between the regulated community and the community leaders, take for an example that we talked some about the Chemical Safety Board. When they recently went to the Chevron refinery in Richmond, California, they didn't go home. And they've issued a pretty damning report about a cavalier attitude towards safety of workers in the community. Thereafter, the community of Richmond filed a lawsuit against Chevron. In the most recent election there in Richmond, Chevron has contributed more than $3 million in an attempt to influence a small, relatively small community election. So I think in this instance, it shows that civil society itself is under attack by a very large corporation that's exhibited a cavalier attitude towards the health and the safety of the very community. So I wonder if the panel can reflect on how do we get to a place of honesty and civility when that's the playing field?
So recognizing that I think no one on this panel is involved with that particular situation, it's a general question on your part, I gather.
Yeah, you can
Okay.
genericize the question.
Okay.
I'm not familiar with the situation, except that,
Public record of $3 million.
well, that's fine. But,
Well, I guess let me suggest, the fact that you know this suggests to me that you've in part answered your question. I mean, you've got a system here whereby, you learn these things and it's public knowledge. That's, seems to me that suggests that that's a far cry different than, lack of civility or lack of transparency. I mean, you're aware and voters are aware, and to the extent that is accurate, and I can't attest to that, but I think that goes a long way to suggesting that the sky is falling is probably a flawed conclusion.
Good. Any other questions or observations from the audience? Getting to the end of a long day, I'm always lucky to get the last panel when people are getting tired. Any other comments from the panel that you want to share? Oh, please.
I'd be interested just in terms of creating these kinds of relationships between regulators and regulated. Sometimes concern that the co-opted by those they are regulating if they're friendly or congenial.
Did everybody in the back hear the question? No. So I'm not sure you're going to tell me if I got it wrong. But it's basically that, is there a concern about the regulated industry and the regulators getting too close, having too close of a relationship as they're building this trust, et cetera? I sort of added to it. Is that fair? Okay.
Well, I'll talk about that a little bit. And I guess I want to say two things. One is that I think that, co-opted, when it's in terms, an agency has a certain number of staff that are available for DEQ, and typically that involves, they are involved in, for instance, permits. They do a lot of reviews, and they depend on the industry to do a lot of the groundwork and coming up with a lot of stuff that they then review. So they aren't the initiators, but they are the reviewers. So I don't think that's being co-opted. I think that that's doing their job within the budgets that's been allocated, and they're doing what they've been told to do. That's a far cry different than, breaking the law by getting offers of jobs that that would maybe pay you more money than in your current position, or being offered job shares, or doing things that are, basically illegal. So, one, I think, serves the function of society and of our goals of protecting health and the environment, and doing it within our political and legal framework. The other doesn't.
I think you raise a really interesting and point, which is, at least in my mind, when I worked with regulatory agencies, I wasn't ever trying to be the best friend of any regulator. The reason being is that I didn't feel that it was good for them or for me or my interests to be perceived that way. I wanted to be able to provide solid information and bring either legal help in or technical specialists to make sure that they were answering the question that often the regulator was initiating in the regulatory process. So I think a lot of different companies perhaps approach this differently, but at least from my perspective, it's very important that companies follow the actual procedures and process that they have and do so with integrity. They need to be as pure as Caesar's wife in their interaction with regulatory people, and not invite improper relationships. In my experience, regulators have been terrific, because I think they've been above board, and especially in Utah and these Rocky Mountain states have been really focused on trying to do the right thing. But I think industry has a responsibility to be as pure as Caesar the wife in terms of their interaction, and making sure that they participate in the process, and also that they encourage and invite other people to participate in the process as well, to give them their voice, because to shut them out, I think, again, contributes to the perception that things are wrong and people aren't being listened to.
Having worked in environmental consulting for a long time, and then industry, from time to time you stumble on a non-compliance situation and maybe your regulator in whatever jurisdiction is just not there, asleep at the wheel, and it's been an ongoing thing, and how could this have happened? Although I know environmental law, regs, policy, I'm kind of on the opposite side, kind of in those internal discussions. And I look at it like you really need to follow the black and the white. If your permit or if your license to operate says this, whether your regulator is telling you that, you need to follow that. And I bring a different context to those discussions, because having lived through various M&A, if your company is bought or sold, and there's due diligence that occurs, and you get a party that comes in and evaluates you, gives you the best audit you could ever dream of, in support of due diligence. They'll find that, and they'll mark down the value of your company. So I tend to try to tackle it that way, to just as another perspective to help snap back to, we need to follow the black and the white, and we need to do what we say to keep the license to operate now and maintain the value of the company. Now, in my heart and personally, I want to, always be compliant and whatnot. But you do find regulators that maybe are just not as knowledgeable, or just unaware, or too much to do. But you can't let that lull you into complacency. You need to follow the law.
Once the legal process starts, everyone goes into their corner. And different set of rules. But prior to that, especially knowing what's coming up, I've never been refused a meeting, and my clients have never been refused a meeting with the agency. And so, industry is trying to get a permit. They're going to be meeting with the agency. So, if citizens feel that, it's out of balance in some way, then it's incumbent on them to participate in the process. I mean, that's just in order to sort of level the playing field a little bit. So, you know, if you're not going to play, then, you know, I guess you don't get to complain, so.
Any other questions?
Have you had a situation where you're seeking to compel something that isn't allowed or under the regulations and statutes? And how do you deal with that, where you're basically up against something that is a political question for a different body, like the legislature, for example? Of that.
Do you have something in mind? Fred?
Gotta rephrase that for us.
Well, sometimes, okay, I work for the Attorney General's
Yeah.
office, who represents I represent the Division of Forestry, Fire and State Lands, and we have a process in the system, and sometimes groups come in and they want to participate in a way that isn't allowed by our regulations and by the law. How are we supposed to deal with that situation in a way that is cooperative and civil and gets to the result where we don't feel like it's really our place, my client doesn't feel like it's our place to solve that problem, it's someone else's.
Do you understand the question, or can I?
Yeah,
ask a
sort of.
question?
I mean, look, this is a complex political environment we're in here. You know, obviously, we have a state government that is pro-development. And so there's going to be a certain amount of tension between groups that object to some of those decisions. And I don't know. I mean, I think that there's a certain amount of latitude that agencies have, and sometimes the groups are trying to push those agencies to exercise that latitude. It's not all black and white. I mean, it's not always, well, the regulation says this. There's wiggle room in there. And I think that, you know, to petition your government to take a certain action that you feel is appropriate, I mean, it's, you know, that's the nature of that type of lobbying. So I mean, I don't know if you have something specific in mind, but, you know, I think it's the job of citizens to push the agency.
Anybody have any final comments?
Yeah, I'd like to comment on that. I think that sometimes, instead of being an attorney issue, sometimes this is more of a group issue. Like, for instance, with the underground storage tank program, they set up a kind of this little side group that involved some of the people that were going to be regulated, kind of a group in different kinds of capacities, like maybe a few consultants and some people that were from one type of service station, another that would be suppliers. And so they would meet every now and then, and they would say, well, these are our concerns, and the agency would say, these are our concerns, and these are the kind of things we're thinking about, and it would be kind of voluntary. But at least that way, that they can discuss issues that are on the radar, but they can do it without being under a lot of pressure in an immediate situation where some kind of a decision has to be made. So I think, you know, that's one way of dealing with that kind of thing, is if you can see some kind of a thread of people that care about what you do, because really a lot of people don't, you know. And then the people that care, they can be on a mailing list, get copies of your rules, be on a mailing list, get copies of your meeting notices, or things to let them be involved where they choose to be.